Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. Well, this is a podcast about ideas, and as such, we deal with such topics as culture and politics. And I was trying to think of somebody I could have on to discuss these things with us, and I could think of nobody better than today's guest. He's an economist, a physicist, a legal scholar, and an anarcho-capitalist theorist, Dr. David D. Friedman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on. I don't think I'm really a physicist. I have a doctorate in physics, but I abandoned the field a very long time ago.
Oh, okay. Well, you're a physicist compared to me. We can put it that way. So you've been involved in, like your bio says, in legal discussions and economics discussions, politics discussions for a very long time. In what ways has the American culture changed in your lifetime? And in what ways has it stayed the same?
That's an interesting question. Uh, I think and the I think there are a couple of changes. I think the general dominance of left-wing ideas, in particular, I think it's true that the universities, at least the elite universities, were generally left wing when I was in college as well, which would have been in the early 60s, a long time ago. But they weren't the same left wing ideas. Uh, so that at that time, they would have been much more friendly to China or the Soviet Union, to Mao, probably not to Stalin. They would have been much more friendly to what I think of as sort of a watered down version of socialism, which is what more or less was called liberalism then. And despite the fact liberalism having meant something very much different 50 or 100 years ago. Uh, and but I think it was a more tolerant version. Uh, Certainly, you did have incidents of speakers being shouted down by students, but they were less common, and they were not generally supported by the faculty. So that I think my impression is that that it's presently the case that this generation of students are considerably more tolerant than their own faculty. Uh, my daughter's observation when she went to Oberlin was that the student population was essentially an ideological monoculture, that the general assumption there was that if you did not agree with current progressive beliefs, you were either stupid or evil. Uh, and that was not her impression of the faculty. That I remember she mentioned one incident, and I probably can't give you the details correctly, where a professor said something which implicitly assumed that all of the students were left wingers in some form or other, agreed with some. And after the class, my daughter pointed out to him that that wasn't true, and he apologized. So it wasn't that he was trying to indoctrinate them. He took it for granted that they all had particular views, and he realized other people might have. Once it was pointed out to him, other people could have different views, and that was all right. So I think the present situation, as I read it, is one in which just a minute, I was just trying to get to change something on my screen to get rid of distractions. Yeah, there we are. That the present situation is one in which the faculty are some of the faculty obviously are committed to sort of woke DEI, et cetera, ideas. I think many more of them are sort of going along with them because it's in their interest to do so, whereas the students are more nearly committed to it. And I think that would be one change. Now, a different and sort of unrelated change is that at this point, libertarian is actually a term people are used to. That when I was in college, my impression is that most people didn't have that category, as it were, in their minds. And now they may or may not have an accurate picture of it, but it's sort of recognized that one of the minor political ideologies is libertarianism. Uh, and that's, I suppose, an improvement of a sorts. Uh, Other than that, I think the I think there's been a significant loss of what I think of as the good part of 1960s liberalism, which was the sort of emphasis on freedom of speech and related things. And I think that still exists. You can see it in the current fights at Harvard, but I think that's no longer something that almost everyone on the left takes for granted as part of their beliefs. That, there certainly were exceptions. I remember arguing with Maoists when I was at college, but they were a very small minority
Sure.
of the relevant population.
You mentioned the universities being basically taken over by left-wing ideologies and left-wing ideologues. To what extent, though, do are people on the right responsible for that in their abandonment of, like, for instance, on the right, there's many people, the religious right at least, who think evolution is just a theory or it's clearly wrong. And when you do that, when you say things like that or push ideas like that, for me to take somebody like that seriously intellectually would be a difficult task. And I can't imagine in a university setting where someone's talking about how no, the Earth is actually 6,000 years old. I mean, it borders on the ridiculous, and it just seems that attitude. I could probably think of more examples, but that's the most salient
Yeah,
one in my mind. That would tend to push educational institutions in a
yeah,
leftward direction.
yeah. Well, I would have to say that generally speaking, I'm more tolerant than you are about people with crazy ideas. Uh, that that it often turns out that somebody can uh, support or believe a nutty idea of which the rejection of evolution, uh, especially in its more extreme forms, classifies, and still be an intelligent and rational person. And it's sort of weird, but it's true. Uh, and in a way, I suppose partly reading things by people who seriously believe in a religion. I'm not sure if I've read anything persuasive by someone who believed that the earth was 6,000 years old. But I've certainly read things by people who believed that Christianity was literally true. C.S. Lewis, for example, or G.K. Chesterton. And reading that, you say, well, yes, this is an intelligent person. He has a
Sure.
coherent view of the universe. I'm just pretty sure it's wrong. Uh, and uh, so in any case, but I would have said that I don't think that was much of an issue when I was a college student. Uh, I was at Harvard in '64 when Barry Goldwater ran for president, and the Crimson had a poll of the students, and they reported, if I remember correctly, that something like 15% of the students were supporting Goldwater. Turned out that was wrong, that they had made a mistake and it was really like about 19%. Not that it matters very much. Uh, I was very much surprised because I would have said there were 6 students supporting Goldwater at Harvard and I knew all of them. And so that was an environment. And, supporting Goldwater had nothing to do with religious issues. That wasn't what he was running on, basically. Uh, so that was a case where I think it was clear that the social pressure was such that unless you were somebody who liked arguing with people, if you had conservative views, you kept quiet about them. Uh, Maybe not with your friends, but in general, not you weren't visibly so. So I don't think. I mean, I don't. My impression, at least, is that the issue over conservatives versus liberals was not mainly over religious fundamentalists. I also suspect that the number of religious fundamentalists gets exaggerated because uh, just as the number of believers uh, in progressive politics gets exaggerated, because if you're in an environment where a particular view is the orthodoxy, you are quiet if you disagree with it, and maybe you say you agree with it. I don't know if you've read uh, the research. I'm trying to remember the name. It's somebody at Yale Law School who I actually was a colleague of mine once at Chicago. Uh, and I've discussed it in some of my writings, but I'm blocking on the name at the moment. Who's done research on why people believe things. And one of his most interesting results is that if you take a belief which has been linked to group membership, of which evolution would be a clear example, uh, that the more, roughly speaking, the more intellectually able you are, the more likely you are to agree with your group's position, whether that means believing in evolution or not believing in evolution.
Oh, wow.
And well, it makes perfect sense once you think about it. Whether I believe in evolution has no effect on the world. All right, I'm one person out of 8 billion people. Whether I believe in evolution has a large effect on me. All right, my environment is the academic world. And if I went around saying the world is 6,000 years old, as you have just demonstrated, people
Yeah,
would not take me seriously. That would
sure.
be very much against my interest to do it, even if I had good evidence for it. Suppose my environment were a Midwest town or a Southern town where almost everybody was a member of the same church. The church was a very important part of your life. It was sort of where you went to find a wife. It was where you went to find friends. It was where you spent, part of the day every week and so forth. And in that environment, everybody knew that people who didn't believe in religion, which for them meant literal biblical religion, were not to be trusted. I mean, there was something wrong with them. Well, it makes a whole lot of sense that you would figure out ways of persuading yourself to believe in, to not believe in evolution. Uh, and uh, Dan Gahan that's the name
Okay.
I have too much of a problem of not remembering words. Dan Gahan was the person. I've tried to persuade him, not successfully, I think, to look at his own beliefs and see whether there are any things that he believes, because they're what the people around him expect him to believe, that he couldn't actually defend. Uh, but but I think there's quite a lot of that. But I don't think, I mean, I don't think that conservative academics uh, were believers in biblical literalism very often. If you think about, say, National Review and the people around them, I've got a Substack post that I haven't put up yet, but probably will in another few days, which is about my experience interacting with Frank Meyer and his family. Frank Meyer was senior editor of National Review. He was an ex-communist conservative. Interesting person because he pushed what he referred to as fusionism, which was at the time, if you think about the conservative movement in the 60s, it was really seen as an alliance between traditionalists and libertarians. And Frank's argument was it was a natural alliance, not just an opportunistic alliance. And his basic argument, which is an interesting one, was that the traditionalists believed that people ought to act virtuously, but it wasn't virtuous if you were compelled to do it. You had to have choice, and therefore traditionalists should all be libertarians. As he would put it, they should be politically libertarians and morally traditionalists. And he argued the other way. I think it's not as clear an argument, but it's a defensible argument, that the only way of defending a culture of belief in individual liberty was if you believed in fundamental moral views, which said it's wrong to do certain things, and that the natural basis for that was sort of a traditionalist religious view. And I met him, I should say. Uh, Frank and Elsie had two sons, John and Jean. And John was looking at colleges, and I was at Harvard. And they had dinner with Ed Banfield, who was a friend of my parents, and invited me to join the dinner. And but I don't know, he may have thought it would be useful for them to have a Harvard student to talk with. And I like to describe it as the most extraordinary evening of my life, because the conversation went roughly as follows. This is in about 1962 or 63. Either I or the Myers said, have you by any chance ever read this very odd book by a man called Tolkien? This is about 8 years after the books were published in England, before they were published in the US. Nobody had ever heard of them.
Wow.
Uh, I had to wait for the second volume to be published. My Uncle Aaron's wife, Catherine, for some reason pointed me at them, and I read them. Half an hour of conversation follows because they are enthusiastic Tolkien fans. I'm an enthusiastic Tolkien fan. Uh, After half an hour or so, have you ever read any of Kipling's poetry? Another half hour. Ever played any Avalon Hill war games? Another half hour. And my parents were spending the year abroad studying monetary systems, and I ended up spending spring vacation with the Myers. And part of what was interesting was that they were all believing Christians. I don't know whether they were, I don't know what particular version of Christianity, and they thought of themselves as conservatives, and they felt like my people. I was an atheist. Uh, so in that sense, I think you can have, but they certainly were not biblical literalists. The John and Jean were both being homeschooled. They the time, at least Frank thought that if anybody had noticed, they could have been forced to send them to school. They both ended up going to Yale. At the time I knew them, I believe that John was the under 21 chess champion of the US and Jean was the under 14 chess champion. And Jean currently runs the Federalist Society, has been doing that for a long time. But it struck me as an interesting case that in a sense, religious beliefs are less important than you think they are, and that sort of ways of thinking are more important. So anyway, I mean that may be a long digression, but
No,
since I
no,
was writing it up,
no, it's perfect. And William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of National Review,
Mhm.
and along the lines you talked about of the fusion, I once had a mini debate with him through the mail. I don't know, 23, 24 years ago. And the question I posed to him was, how can conservatives, on one hand, make the argument for small government, economic liberty, property rights, and then on the other hand, support pornography laws? And he gave me an answer that to me was woefully inadequate. His answer was that, well, think about parking. There's laws pertaining to parking, which is a good thing. So why can't there be laws pertaining to pornography, which is a bad thing? And there were so many fallacies in
Yeah,
that statement to me. I didn't respond. I had a lot going on at the time, but
yeah,
to me, that fusion that Frank Meyer talked about, it it breaks down at
yeah,
certain points. And when it comes to things like pornography, I would say that's one issue, because the religious or sort of, I don't want to use the word hatred, uh, antipathy towards pornography gets in the way of the individual rights, freedom,
yeah.
ideology.
But it's also true that among non-religious people of generally libertarian views, there's a substantial range in how far they push those views.
Sure.
Uh, so I would not be astonished to find that there were no atheist conservatives who, in general, were in favor of the free market but thought pornography should be banned. My interaction with Buckley, incidentally, is that I had a column in the New Guard, which was the Young Americans for Freedom magazine, where I was their sort of token libertarian columnist. Uh, and it was entitled, Is William F. Buckley a Contagious Disease? And that was because Buckley, as you may know, had taken the position when he was running for mayor of New York, that uh, it was legitimate to isolate drug addicts on the grounds that drug addiction was really a contagious disease. And my point was that a drug addict persuades somebody else to be a drug addict, not by contagion, but by persuasion, by spreading a certain idea. Well, that's how Buckley tries to persuade other people to be conservatives.
Yes.
And therefore, by his definition, he was a contagious disease. And he wrote a response, and I wrote a response to that. And I don't remember the details. But the interesting thing is that Buckley eventually came around, at
Yes, he
least
did.
on marijuana. I don't know whether he came around
I
on other
believe he
drugs
did.
or not.
I believe he did. That essay you're talking about, that was in your book Machinery of Freedom, right?
Yeah,
Because
right.
because it sounds familiar, and I've read that. I've read your
Yeah,
book. So when it comes to culture and politics, mix. There's often a thin
yeah.
line. In two areas or two movements where I would say that is the case are with the MAGA movement and the woke movement. What is your opinion of each, starting with MAGA?
Uh, I think that Trump is a demagogue. He's a pretty competent demagogue, does not seem to be a very competent runner of a country, which may be fortunate. Uh, I think I don't think the intellectual level of the MAGA movement is very high, from what I can tell. In fact, I'm not really sure if there is a movement outside of Trump himself.
Yes.
The part I sympathize with really is sort of the negative part, namely the idea that the orthodox elite are not to be trusted, and that's correct. And that's, I've been making that argument now for whatever, 60 years or so in various contexts. I've done a lot of writing in the last 15 or 20 years on climate issues. Uh, I think it's pretty clear that the global temperatures are trending up. And it is probably the case that human production of CO2 is a major cause of that, although it's hard to be certain because climate's a very complicated system. But once you go beyond that, there's a whole lot of respectable stuff that's complete nonsense. Uh, I had a I have in my I had a post in my Substack uh, on an article in Nature which claims to estimate the total cost from putting CO2 in the air for the next 300 years. Anybody who takes that seriously, that's complete nonsense. You just
Yeah.
don't know enough.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you go into how they did the calculation, they are implicitly assuming that there will be no medical progress for the next 300 years, because about half their cost is increased mortality due to higher temperatures, which is pretty dubious actually for other reasons, but put that aside. Mortality due to higher temperatures is the result of people getting various diseases and having things happen to them. They are doing their calculation on the basis of recent past data. Well, if you decrease the mortality rate from heart attacks by a factor of 2, which is pretty modest for 300 years, you decrease that element of mortality from
Sure.
temperature and so forth and everything. And the whole thing. And what I found particularly outrageous is that the article devotes a paragraph or two to reasons why their estimate might be too low. And they never even mention reasons why it might be too high, which are pretty obvious. Uh, and that's respectable. That's published in Nature magazine. And it's true of a whole lot of other stuff. I mean, so at this point, I mean, part of the one of the terms that I found useful in thinking about this whole thing is the term flyover country. Uh, and it's the perception by a whole lot of people that there is an elite in this country, which they associate with the East Coast and the West Coast, although it's much more complicated than that, of course. And that elite looks down on them. And I think they're right. Uh,
Sure.
and I think that the looking down is not justified, because although it is certainly true that the non-elite, lots of people in the non-elite have silly views, so do lots of people in the elite. They're just different silly views. Uh, and so that's the part of the MAGA movement that I sympathize with. The idea that you should not trust the New York Times, because you shouldn't. The New York Times is obviously a wildly biased source of information. Uh, anyway, but I don't think there's much intellectual content there. That, as far as I can tell, Trump says whatever he thinks will get him votes at the
Yeah.
moment, uh, and votes and attention and the various things he wants.
Yeah.
The other side of that, the woke movement, has it's got intellectual content, but I think most of it is bogus. Although
Yeah.
it's not something I've studied very carefully. But as far as I can tell, when I actually come across bits of historical, there's a book which tries to claim that Jim Buchanan was an evil person in all sorts of reasons. And, I wouldn't say that Jim was my favorite person. I thought Gordon Tullock was the more interesting of the two. Uh, but they the book depended on false statements of various sorts, and that's been true of a lot of the things of that sort I've seen. So I don't think very highly uh, of. I think that one is more nearly a coherent set of beliefs, but they're sort of weird beliefs, and they're beliefs which I don't think really stand up to the evidence that the faith that the only reason there are differences in how well blacks and whites do is because the whites are all racists. Uh, you look at the fact that on both race and gender, this is very nearly the least biased society that's ever existed there.
Yeah.
Somewhere you could probably find an exaggeration and something the other of which that's more true, but it would be pretty hard, uh, and there isn't much evidence for it. So anyway, the so I guess I would say that both of those are ideologies that I reject. That one of the things that's been happening in libertarianism, as you probably know, is that the Libertarian Party had an internal takeover. And what was basically happening was that what the party used to be doing was was watering down libertarian views in order to appeal to the center and the left. And it got taken over by people who wanted to water down libertarian views by appealing to the right.
Yes.
And
You've actually preempted an upcoming question of mine, because you're right. I've gotten into it with some of those people. I actually stopped calling myself a libertarian after 20 some odd years because of that, because I just don't want to be associated with people that
yeah,
are praising Ted Kaczynski, for instance. It just
yeah,
seems absurd. It's like the magnification of the liberty movement. See, to me, I think you're onto something there, where I think that it's really the Trump movement. They can say it's not about Trump, but it's a cult of
yeah,
personality. But I
yes.
think you're right that they identify legitimate criticisms. For instance, to me, it's unquestionable that the government behaved inappropriately during the COVID pandemic. But what
Mhm.
many in the Trump movement or the MAGA movement then do is jump to an additional conclusion that is anti-intellectual, that, well, COVID is fake. Or we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that COVID was manufactured in a lab. It very well may have. I don't know where it
Mhm.
came from ultimately, but
Mhm.
I know that there's not proof that it came from a lab, or that it
Yes.
was manufactured. And they seem to do that with a lot of these things. Like, a person can at the same time say the government overreacted to January 6th, but the January 6th protesters, many of them were Trump supporters and behaved very, very badly. But
Mhm.
they go to saying either they were FBI plants or they were Antifa plants, or
Mhm.
it really didn't happen. And
Mhm.
that seems to be that you can go down that, in that train of thinking, where they offer a
But
legitimate critique, but then fill that blank, or fill the empty
but
space with
but but they,
anti-intellectual
but there's
stuff.
a reason why they're doing that, and the reason why they're doing that is that they don't have sources of information they can trust.
Yes.
That I've The way I put it at some point was that it is Fauci's fault that a majority of Republicans think the election was stolen. Not that he ever said anything about the election, but there is a New York Times interview with Fauci where he admits that he's a liar. He
Yes.
doesn't put it that way,
No,
but
yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
he says that he will change, that he is planning to change his estimate of what percentage of people have to have gotten COVID to get herd immunity in response to polling data, to data on what people will believe, basically. Well, that means that either his previous estimate or his new estimate is not really his estimate. It's really what he wants people to believe. But that's one tiny example of the reason that you can't say, just go to respectable authorities and find out what's true. And if you can't find out what's true, people have a very strong tendency to believe what they want to believe. And I suspect that you could find that same tendency on the left, that on a bunch of factual things, on what's happening in the present Israel Hamas war, that I think you would probably find a noticeable number of people who believe facts that are pretty clearly not true about it.
Yeah.
Uh, and because they don't have sources that they trust, they're telling them the truth. And discovering what's true is not a trivial problem. Uh,
No, especially when you can't trust sources. I mean, if I had a worry when I go to a car mechanic, I don't know how to fix a car. I have to go on reputation and trust when I go to
yes,
a car mechanic. And if I couldn't have that, how do I fix my car? And it's a similar thing with the media, where if you can't trust the media and you can't trust traditional sources, I mean, I can't independently go do every scientific study to figure
yes,
out how much CO2 is rising, for instance,
yes,
or how much effect humans have on
yeah,
that. I have to ultimately trust people based on reputation, and if that reputation is gone,
yeah,
then my ability to gain information is largely
yeah.
gone as well.
One of the things on my webpage is a list of my Substack posts sorted by topic. And let me find it for a moment, because one of the topics is essentially that problem. Uh, that Let me go there and see how I put it. Uh, it is discovering truth. And I guess I've had about 15 or 20 posts on that subject. One of them was an exchange with Mike Humer. He's a libertarian philosopher. He's somebody I
Yeah.
think highly of.
I
Uh,
debated him on anarcho-capitalism versus minarchism.
which side were you on?
Minarchist.
You know, uh, but uh, the but Mike had on his Substack post a post arguing essentially that you should believe sort of the scientific authorities. I don't remember that's exactly how he put it, but it was something along those lines. And uh, and I had a post responding to that, uh, and just trying to see if I've got a. Uh, he, he is in favor of believing the experts. Uh, Experts tend to be better than non-experts at correctly assessing difficult issues due to their obvious cognitive advantages over lay people, and so forth and so on. And I've had fairly long uh, posts, various points arguing that the supposed experts on certain subjects are pretty clearly wrong, the climate being the clearest example. And basically, the conclusion we came to was that Michael was writing for different people than I was. He didn't think I should believe the experts, but that is one of the lines he mentions. One of the things I quoted is the experts typically have greater than average intelligence. Well, so do I. So I suspect to most of my readers, though I could be wrong about that. I have no way of knowing who my readers are, except for the few who comment. Uh, and so it seems to me that there are ways in which, if you are bright and willing to go to some trouble, you can get a reasonable opinion on whether the experts are to be trusted on a particular issue. But you have to conclude that on a large number of issues, you just don't know. That it's more work. It's more work than it's worth. So I have a post on the question of the origin of COVID, and I tried to do a sort of a very simple probabilistic estimate from what we knew, and I concluded that it was probably a lab leak. Uh, Basically, that the probability that it would have shown up close to a lab that was doing exactly the kind of research that could have produced it, gain of function research on related bat viruses, was an awful lot higher if it was a lab leak than if it was a natural thing. And there are a lot of live markets. So if it was something that happened at a live market, it could have happened in any of probably 5,000 live markets around the world. Doesn't have to be in China. Wasn't even close to the bat caves. Whereas there are a very small number of people doing that kind of research. Only two labs that I know of. One of them in the U.S. So anyway, but that was one case where I was interested enough to do it. But if you ask me about, is there a problem with honeybees, which supposedly there was a while ago, and now supposedly there isn't, and various other things of that sort. And there are climate issues where I don't think where I might be able to form an opinion if I was willing to do enough work. I'm not even sure I could. That from my standpoint, the big my basic view on climate, which I've discussed in print multiple times, is that the change has both good and bad effects, that they are both large and uncertain, and we don't know whether the net effect is positive or negative. Uh, the bad effect that I'm least sure of at the moment is lowering the pH of the oceans. That people refer to that as acidification, which is technically true but rhetorically wrong, because the oceans are basic. So what you're actually doing is neutralizing them. You're moving the pH of the ocean closer to neutral. And acidification sounds scary because it sounds like the oceans are becoming acid. But nonetheless, changing the pH of the oceans might indeed have real effects. It might have substantial effects because the all of the organisms currently in the ocean are adapted to their present environment. You're changing that environment rather slowly, but faster than it usually changes. Uh, and that might result in a bunch of organisms not being able to survive. It might result in, less plankton turning CO2 into oxygen and so forth and so on. There are lots of things that could happen. It could, fish are an important food source. And if the small things that the fish at the bottom of the food chain eat disappear, that could have serious. So that's one where I would say it could be that it'll have no effect at all. It could be that have a very large negative effect. I can't tell. I'm not sure one could tell, but I'm pretty sure I can't. And there are undoubtedly other things of that sort, even within climate, which I spent a lot of time thinking about. And if you ask me about, what's the best way of teaching kids to read, I don't know. And so
See,
forth. So
your method of thinking is very similar to mine in that you're obviously, I mean, we went through your bio at the beginning, very educated, obviously very bright. Nobody can deny it. You've done research into the origins of COVID and came out with a tentative conclusion based on probability. There are people who will go on the internet, shop for sources, and then come out with an absolute level of certainty that's just not warranted. That, I don't know if bothers, disturbs me because, like, when it comes to climate change, I find Alex Epstein, I don't know if you've heard of him, but I find his arguments very persuasive. But I don't know enough about climate change to know how much it's changing, which scientists are more accurate than others. I have no idea. I do think that if the government's going to infringe on people's liberty, they ought to be able to make a very strong case. And from what I've seen, the government has not done that. And therefore, I always side on the side of liberty. But I don't then jump to the conclusion because I'm in favor of liberty and just say climate change is a hoax. It's all fake. It's manufactured.
yeah.
But people that do that, and I just wonder, back to my original question about culture, is that something new with the social media culture that we have now, or was that always there?
I think the respect for the experts has declined. And that's partly because the experts have gotten worse, and partly because people have noticed that they were never very good. Uh, and uh, the so that's a change. But going back for a moment to the people who find sources on the internet to believe something, the question that I want to ask is how many of them actually take actions based on that belief which affect them? So if
Yeah,
you
that's a
go
good
back to
question.
COVID, there are various things that people on the right believed you should do about COVID. Uh, Many of those things were not particularly dangerous. So that there was a medicine which there was some evidence that was actually extensively used for getting rid of internal parasites, for deworming,
Yeah, ivermectin, right?
chloroquine, and
And
I
there
don't
was
remember the exact name.
hydroxychloroquine in ivermectin.
Yeah.
And with ivermectin, there was some evidence that it alleviates COVID, but I've heard people say that ivermectin's a cure for cancer. And then that
Yes,
exactly, they jump to
but
the other extreme.
yes, but the question I want to know is how many people took actions which would have been clearly in their interest if this belief was true, and clearly against their interest if it was false. Because it's very easy to, it's a lot of fun to to say, well, look, I've got the secret, I've got the truth, and people have been doing that for a long time in lots of different contexts.
Sure.
But then do you act on it? And I suspect a lot of people don't, but some do. So the one of them, I think it was the ivermectin. People were talking about people poisoning themselves by taking horse uh, medicine, and of
Yeah,
course, it was
yeah,
also human medicine. It's
yeah.
ivermectin was used for deworming both humans and horses. And one possible conjecture about the positive evidence for it against COVID was that that was in places where a lot of people had internal parasites, and if you got rid of the internal parasites, they were less likely to die of COVID, which is a
That's interesting.
plausible.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was basically on the Slate Star Codex uh, when Scott Alexander looked at the question. That was the conjecture. I don't think he claimed he could prove it, that he thought might be going on. Uh, but in any case, uh, but yeah, but of course, part of the problem here is that voting is not a case where it matters. That from the standpoint of the individual voter, he can uh, claim to believe something, which in his individual behavior he doesn't believe, but in his voting behavior he does believe. It's a very cheap way of signaling that you agree with whatever the views are that you want to be thought to believe in. And that's one of the reasons why democracy works so badly.
it does. You're right. Now, speaking of experts, I guess they'd be called experts. The liberty movement has had some very powerful personalities and some very great intellects. I'm thinking, for instance, Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises, your father, Milton Friedman. Now, these are the thinkers that have so greatly influenced who I am as a person and how I view the world. I don't see any thinkers in the liberty movement or personalities on that level today. Do you? Are there any out there that approximate the great liberty-minded thinkers of
You
the
know,
20th
that's
century?
an interesting question. And the answer is nobody occurs to me, but I might not know. That is, it may be something that only becomes obvious afterwards. Uh, the I mean, there have certainly been some very able people. Werner Vinge, who just died, was a science fiction writer, pretty good science fiction writer, but also put ideas into circulation. He's the person who is responsible for the idea that as technological progress feeds on itself, you might get a sort of sharp break in which in his science fiction version, basically after date X, the world no longer makes sense to people before date X because there's been so much change that and people are worrying. Singularity is the term that's used for it. People are worrying. He was a libertarian. One of his short stories, in fact, he ends by saying that the world that he's describing is inspired by my machinery of freedom. Uh, it's a short story is called The Ungoverned. It's a good story. And part of what's interesting is what he uh, as a novelist or storyteller adds to my picture, because it's consistent with my picture, but it's got a lot more of the sort of details and real world feel to it than what I say in machinery. Uh, so I would say he was a first rate mind, but I don't think he had that large an influence from a libertarian standpoint. His idea of singularity certainly had a large influence. It's one of the things related to people's worry about AI at the moment. Uh, and I think the general rationalist movement strikes me as, on the whole, a good thing. I'm not sure how large it is, but in a way, the rationalists feel to me like what the humanists tried to be, namely a non-theistic religion. Uh, and I attended an event of theirs in the last year, and it felt an awful lot like a church service, even though God did not enter into it. And their basic beliefs are, I think, generally libertarian, generally uh, not too willing to believe woke stuff and so forth. Uh, One of my favorite writers at this point uh, is doing fanfic for a site called Glowfic, and she has a character, fictional character, who basically is whose solution to the problem of conflict of interest is to commit herself to behave in such a way that people will find it in their interest to interact with her. Uh, so that there's a sort of a striking, the author makes the point in a scene in one of the stories where somebody has given her information that's very valuable to her. Her response to that is to get a neutral party to figure out how much she would have paid for that information in a bargain sale, and then give that amount of money to the person who provided the information for free. Uh, and that's very much a sort of a libertarian. It's an attempt to imagine a world where behaving the way you'd like libertarians to behave is actually in your rational self-interest. Uh, my comment on it, and I think actually in one of my posts, was that I thought I had seen the idea before, and then I realized I had written it, because I have a discussion in a couple of places of what I think of as the economics of virtue and vice, where the basic argument is that behaving well with regard to those people with whom you have a voluntary interaction is in your selfish interest, because the increase in what they will pay you to interact with you is greater than the decrease in the amount you could get by cheating them or stealing them or whatever. That's a very short summary of the argument, but it's basically what she is in a fictional version doing. And mundanely, she writes for Vox, is a fairly well-known Vox writer, and that is very good, I'm sure. But what I find really neat is that she's doing fiction, which is portraying individual decision making, as it were, in a way that promotes libertarian kind of ways of thinking. And in general, the rationalists know more economics than most people do. They know more probability theory. They're all Bayesians, which is an appropriate thing to be, I think, since people routinely misuse classical statistics, don't understand what it really means. So that, I guess that's one thing that strikes me as an odd element that's come into the culture in the last decade or so, that strikes me that I feel pretty good at. I'm not sure I would consider myself a rationalist. I sort of like there used to be communist sympathizers. I'm a rational simp, in that I on the whole like the pattern, but very few of my ideas came from them. So
See,
in that sense,
my introduction to ideas really in general, and liberty ideas in specifically, were Frederick Bastiat's The Law and Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. And Free to Choose was so powerful to me because it broke down complex ideas, made them very understandable to me. Sometimes these things were counterintuitive, went against what I was inundated with, just by osmosis, basically from the culture.
yeah,
And I just don't see anything like that out there today. Now, obviously, I'm not viewing every book, and I'm not, hearing every liberty thinker out there, but it just doesn't seem there's
yeah,
anybody out there on that level. Now for the question that you preempted a little bit earlier.
yeah, yeah.
The Libertarian Party, if my memory serves me correctly, in the Machinery of Freedom, you talked about that the Libertarian Party, basically political parties are there to get elected. And as such, what they're going to end up doing is watering down, I don't know if that's the word you used then, the message. And it seems like that is indeed what happened. But what is your view of the current state of the Libertarian Party?
Uh, I'm not sure I know enough to have a strong view, but my impression is this goes back partly to my view of the Mises Institute, which the good thing about Mises Institute is they've put a huge amount of stuff available for free online.
Yes.
Uh, and some of the stuff I was writing, uh, I was dependent on being able to use their source material to check things that I otherwise couldn't have easily checked. And one of their people was very helpful to me. So in that sense, they're useful. But I think at the same time that they are in many ways a bad influence, that they're committed to Rothbard's ideas, and Rothbard's economics is distinctly nutty. I've got to a long debunking of that, which I produced. Basically, one of the Rothbardians, who's a nice guy, wanted to debate me, and I on Austrian versus Chicago School or something like that, economics or versus. They sometimes think it's versus neoclassical, but I would have said that Austrian is neoclassical. It's just a different branch of neoclassical economics. Uh, and so I said, all right, what version of Austrian do you want? And he pointed me at Rothbard's book. And so I read enough of the book to be able to see that a lot of it didn't make any sense, and wrote that up in some detail. Had a blog post, had a Substack post on it, and a chapter draft that I may or may not ever make use of on my webpage. Uh, but uh, so in that sense, I think they have a bad influence. Uh, and I think they are too sympathetic uh, to the right wing in the sense of the Trump right wing. I think that their current uh, uh, they're, again, I'm blocking names. The German Rothbardian,
Papa.
who's Papa, yeah, Papa. I think he's bright. Uh, he's not a stupid person, but I think he's very much a bad influence in the
I do too.
sense that just as the Libertarian Party 3 years ago was trying to find ways of sounding as though they were nice people who got along with the left. So he is trying to find ways of being against immigration, uh, more or less, I would say, in some sense, against liberty with excuses of various sorts. Uh,
Yeah. That's
and I
my
think that's
take on
unfortunate.
it. The way I see it is as if they started off opposing immigration and then thought of how can we argue against this within a libertarian framework. It doesn't
Yes,
seem it was a
correct.
conclusion arrived at, but much like Friedrich Hayek said of Keynes, that Keynes had political views and developed an economic theory to support them rather
Yeah.
than the reverse.
That may well be true. I don't know enough about Keynes, but uh, that's certainly the feeling, and I think you could see it in the past on the other side too. Occasionally, that uh, you want to get along with people, you want to persuade people. If they think you're horrible, you won't persuade them. It's just a
Right.
change in who you're trying to persuade. Yeah, no, I had back when I was doing a blog rather than a Substack, I had a piece. Let me see if I can find that, which was an argument with, I think, with David Smith, if I remember correctly. Uh,
The comedian.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and
I am absolutely chomping at the bit to debate Dave Smith, but
yeah, that would
I don't have the following. He'll all he'll do is give me snarky replies on Twitter. He won't actually
yeah, well,
engage with me, but one
in my
day he will.
in my case, I had a blog post uh, which was uh, criticizing his ideas, and at some point he had something responding to it, but his response, it was reasonably clear that he was responding to it as he read it, because there was one point at which I say something and he makes an argument against it, and he then discovers that my next paragraph is the response to that argument. uh, so uh, but no, I'm not sure if I've had anything on the Substack. For some reason, there's something weird going on with my with my old blog, such that wait a minute, I know a different way of getting at this. Just a minute. Uh, at the suggestion of one of the commenters on my Substack, I now have a search bar which covers almost everything I've written. And I bet if I put David Smith in that, there we are. Right. Here we are on Blogspot. I've got one on Dave Smith's response to me, and which was a podcast. And was he responding to? Anyway, let's see. I can probably, if you're curious, my somewhat distant interaction with him, I assume I can give you text
Yeah,
here
if you
somehow.
can get me a link, that would be great. I'll include it with the episode.
I'm just trying to figure out chat. That's what I want. Chat. I'm chatting as a guest. That's fine. That's the link to my comment on his response to me. And I sort of thought that I had, that what he was responding to was,
But they basically make the argument that government owned property is communally owned property by Americans. It's analogous to private property, so therefore
you
it's
know,
okay to ban people from going, from coming across it unless invited. So my response to him was, okay, well, I believe something like only 30% or some number like that is federal land. You've also have privately owned land and you have state owned land. So who's going to make the decisions in regard to that? And are you going to have a referendum each time to see who can come in?
you
And
know,
the idea that somebody has to invite you in, I've never been personally invited to McDonald's. There's an open invitation to anybody that wants to come to McDonald's. So the idea that
yeah,
somebody has to personally invite a foreigner, and he
yeah,
gets into making arguments about how, well, that's akin to saying heroin addicts should be able to shoot up in
yeah,
schools, and of course it's not. They're very different dynamics.
yeah,
But he never responds to the objections I make. He once in a
yes.
while will just make a sarcastic
Yeah,
remark.
I actually had two different blog posts, and I've now given you a link for both of them.
Okay,
One of them
perfect,
is, I think, the one that he switched, and that's uh, that's the one in which I'm responding to their
perfect,
to the hobby line of argument about.
perfect. So hopefully
So,
people will read it.
but if you read that, you can at least see whether my arguments are the same
I
as
will read
yours.
for absolute certainty. Okay,
The
Dr. Friedman, where can people find you?
uh, you can find me on my webpage, which is daviddfriedman.com. www. You don't really need that.
Yeah.
daviddfriedman.com. Uh, from that, you can find my Substack, which I put a post out on every 3 days. Uh, I will have one up in another 59 minutes because I mainly as a constraint on myself, not for my readers. I try to put them up at noon every 3 days, and I've got one ready to go, which I've started putting up, and I will use the time after. One reason we have to quit pretty soon is that I need to get it up by noon.
Great.
Uh, it my Substack posts cover a very wide range of things. This particular post is about the evils of using edited versions of other people's poems, in particular songs which change the words. And I'm arguing that there is something wicked about stealing other people's text for your ideas. Uh,
That's good.
and and the next one is actually going to be the story I was telling you about my interaction with the Myers uh, family. But I've had if you go to the web page, one of the things at the top of the web page is the uh, is the Substack posts sorted by topic, and you can look at my old Substack posts, and
Okay.
they've largely I'm no longer posting on my blog, and the blog is still there. It's called Ideas, and I'm pretty sure I have a link to it somewhere. Uh, but uh, but at the moment I'm doing the Substack. My webpage also has links to the text of most of my books, which you can read for free online, and it has links to most of my published articles, both academic and non-academic articles. And
Excellent.
if you look hard enough, it'll have has a list of the collection of chapter drafts, which I was producing before I started doing my Substack, which are intended to eventually turn into a book. Although at the moment, I'm not sure that Substack doesn't make more sense than a book anyway, since it's a different way of doing the same thing.
Okay.
Uh,
Well, thank you so much for sharing your morning with us. This has been a very fun discussion, very enlightening.
uh-huh.
And I truly am. You are a delight to talk to, sir.
Very good. Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Bye bye.
Thank you. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.